We are honored today to have with us Lynn Williams to bring us his perspective on some of these changes. Mr. Williams is a native of Springfield, Ontario, a graduate of McMaster College in Hamilton, Ontario, and a veteran of the Canadian Navy during World War II. He grew up in small mill towns in Canada, where he could see firsthand the impact of unemployment on the lives of men and women and all the dislocations that entailed. He became a union supporter in those early years, and he has remained a union man all of his life. His first union job was as an organizer with the Canadian Congress of Labor, and he joined the staff of the United Steelworkers of America in 1956. He rose through the ranks of that union, becoming director of the Toronto District in 1973, international secretary of the union in 1977, and international president in 1983, a post he has held since then. He is a member of many educational, political, and civic organizations, has been honored by many of them for his contributions not only in labor relations but in human rights work in general. Business Week magazine has called him labor's rising star, an articulate man who will push hard for industrial policies to help the steel industries in both Canada and the United States. He is one of America's most distinguished labor leaders, and we are delighted to have him with us today. Please welcome Lynn Williams.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your fulsome introduction, and thank you and all the members of the Portland City Club, the ladies and gentlemen gathered here today for the opportunity to be with you in this beautiful city and to have the opportunity to share a few ideas with you on my own behalf and on behalf of the members of my union. I appreciate this visit and this chance to be with you very much indeed. I've attended scores of meetings such as this in recent years where the subject has been a variation on today's theme, how to put America back to work and at good jobs, how to make America competitive in a global economy. I've heard and seen arguments on all sides of the question, statistics and theories, charts and graphs, pleas for workers to become more cooperative with management, for managers to make employees feel they're part of the team, discourses on fair trade, free trade, dumping, protectionism, Smoot-Hawley, trade bills, congressional action, and presidential vetoes. There's been merit to some of these arguments. Some of them I've used myself. And there is a validity to making them, because we obviously need to draw the dimensions of the problem to arrive at a solution. But while we've been talking, the problem and the dimensions have been growing. So we need to raise other questions. Are we simply talking to ourselves? Have we become fiddlers on the economic balcony, consumed by the flames of our own rhetoric? There are some suffering the pangs of an empty stomach, the finality of lost hope, overcome with despair, who would answer yes. We've all seen them, young and old, male and female, of different races and colors, and their numbers have been increasing. They are not merely entries on a ledger. In Pittsburgh, across the street from the Steelworkers headquarters, St. Mary's Catholic Church has been providing free lunches for years to the homeless and the needy. At one time, not too long ago, the food line started forming about 11 a.m., usually populated by men, aged 40 or above. These days, they begin queuing up at about 9:30 because the line is longer, swollen by younger people and women. The story is much the same at the Rainbow Kitchen in Homestead, Pennsylvania, which serves one meal a day, 5 days a week, to more than 100 people, among them pregnant women and children as young as 3. In Kansas, according to a report last week in the New York Times, hunger has become a constant among many farm families. A sociology professor quoted by the Times says, "Third world conditions have reached the Middle West." And the farmer featured in the report told the Times, "The kids aren't getting enough to eat. There's times when my youngest says to me, 'Daddy, I'm hungry.'" While farmers and their families go hungry in Kansas, while pregnant women eat at soup kitchens in Pennsylvania, we hear claims, truthful claims no doubt, about record numbers of job holders. We read of fortunes being made every day on Wall Street, of aspirations for fancy cars and VCRs, paeans to Adam Smith and requiems for John Keynes. I think it's time that less emphasis be placed on what is present in America's rec rooms and more thought given to what is absent from America's dining rooms. If we don't, then we'll keep hearing the plaintive words, "Daddy, I'm hungry." I think also that the spirit and dynamism that is America will help us emerge from this stifling dichotomy. In truth, we've made a start in that direction, and it is not in that vague area called competitiveness, a concept which has yet to be defined to my satisfaction, and which I'll discuss in more detail shortly. We've made our start with the trade bill, but it's only a start, and it's quite tentative given the President's disposition toward it. Even though the bill is considerably less than we in labor believe it can or should be, it demonstrates a growing awareness on the part of the Congress on the perils of the administration's laissez-faire policies. Our larger problem, however, is not opposition to the bill per se, as expressed most forcefully by President Reagan, but the rationale generating that opposition, the willingness, indeed the eagerness, to write off America's industrial base and herald its succession by services and high technology. Such notions are ill-conceived. They posit this tradition on a natural economic progression in which each entity is self-sufficient. The fact is that there is an ordered interdependency beginning with a healthy industrial base. The issue is clouded even further by representations that the key to America's global economic success is lower wages. What that would lead to, of course, what it already has achieved, is a drastic reduction in the standard of living for millions of Americans. One vital priority is a clear recognition that 18th century trade theories are not applicable to the trade problems of the late 20th century. Let's start with the idea being advanced by free traders that mature industries, such as steel, should be permitted to expire as their direct share of the gross national product recedes, taking the nation into the post-industrial era of services and high technology. Well, it's one thing for an industry to shrink and employ fewer people. It's something else again to say we can get along without that industry, or that its reduced prominence significantly diminishes its contribution to the total economy. The post-industrial service economy theory is refuted by Stephen Cohen and John Seisman, directors of the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy. Here is what they say. We are not experiencing a transition to a post-industrial society, but from one kind of industrial society to another. They cite agriculture to buttress their point. Agriculture hasn't gone offshore, as many American manufacturers have, nor has production suffered. A significant change has been toward automation or mechanization. While direct employment in agriculture is about 3 million, there are support jobs, services linked to the farms, pushing agricultural employment as high as 8 million or more. In the steel industry, for example, it is estimated that every job in a mill creates 2 or 3 jobs outside the mill. Cohen and Zeisman remind us that 25% of the gross national product consists of services purchased by American manufacturers. Eliminate the manufacturers, and you eliminate not only the people in their employ, but also those employed in the services. In a nutshell, if I may borrow part of an expression used recently by the President, the evidence tells us that mature industries not only can survive, they can prosper and enhance our economy and our standard of living. What we ought to be doing is finding ways to make this happen instead of engaging in a destructive debate on the merits of pulling the plug. The process isn't enhanced when the President disparages opponents to his budget by calling them nuts, and the Vice President, even tongue-in-cheek, demeans American auto workers. One element injected into this debate is competitiveness. It's a nice-sounding word, but what does it really mean? My office dictionary defines it as inclined, desiring, or suited to compete. To compete is to strive for an objective, leading us into competition, described as an effort to secure business by offering the most favorable terms. Well, certainly we're inclined and desirous of competing, but are we suited? There's no question we have an objective, but can we offer the most favorable terms? The major portion of the answers rests with the administration and the Congress and what they do about meaningful trade legislation, the budget deficit, and the trade deficit. Labor has done its share and then some, and it is willing to do more, despite the heavy price working people have paid already in job losses, work rule changes, wage and benefit reductions, and altered lifestyles. In the steel industry, for example, our members accepted wage reductions of more than $2 billion in 1983, but Wheeling-Pittsburgh Steel wound up in bankruptcy. In 1986, many of our members again were called upon for sacrifices, including $3.60 an hour per worker at LTV. LTV is now in bankruptcy. Simultaneously, there has been a sharp increase in productivity and quality, particularly notable in the steel industry, where our hours per ton in the American steel industry are the lowest in the world. Yet the specter of bankruptcy remains. Despite these productivity advances and cost reductions, direct imports this year will eat up 22% of the U.S. steel market, principally because foreign producers are dumping their product, or they are being subsidized by their governments, or their wages are as low as 1/10 what they are in this country, or any combination of these reasons. It follows then that the American steel industry can't compete on the basis of wages. It can't compete when foreign producers, as in England, France, West Germany, are subsidized, and it can't compete when steel is sold here for less than its cost of production. Imagine where we would be were it not for voluntary restraint agreements with certain of the world's steel producers. These agreements are supposed to limit imports to 18.5% of the American market, a limit that has been exceeded each of the 3 years the VRAs have been in existence. I would point out here that the import penetration of 22% represents only finished or semi-finished steel products. When indirect imports are included, that is, steel used in such things as cars, appliances, or tools, the figure rises to 36%. The results for the steel industry and its employees and their communities have been devastating. Multi-billion-dollar losses, bankruptcies, 300,000 lost jobs, wage and benefit reductions, retirement incomes placed in jeopardy, elimination of essential municipal services, all to little avail. Small wonder children are saying, "Daddy, I'm hungry," even when Daddy is retrained and manages to find another job. And retraining is one of the ways we have been trying to deal with structural unemployment in the steel industry. Unfortunately, only a small portion of the trainees find new jobs, and those jobs usually pay less than half the former wages, making it impossible for a family to get by. The most striking example I can think of to illustrate this quandary occurred 4 years ago following a visit to Pittsburgh by President Reagan. During a tour of a local college, he met a young steelworker who had been out of a job for a year and was studying electronics. When the steelworker gave President Reagan a copy of his resume, the resultant publicity got him a job with Radio Shack. But he had to leave his new job. When offered the opportunity to return to the mill, because this new high-tech job paid him only half the amount he was making in the mill, an amount on which he could not decently support himself and his family. I don't mean to imply, nor should you infer, that we should abandon retraining. What I am saying is that there must be a means to narrow, if not eliminate, the income gap. The persistent and pervasive consequences of the devastation in the steel industry prompted a fundamental change in the union's approach to collective bargaining in recent years, requiring us not only to ensure the best interests of our members, but to save an industry. We have, through all kinds of complications and so on, finally more or less completed our 1986 negotiations. In the process, we have had a short strike and 2 long and bitter lockouts based on principle and social conscience. We have made innovative strides in employment security and worker participation, and the industry seems to have stabilized, even if temporarily. We also concluded that government had to play a major role because neither labor nor management alone, nor the two of us acting jointly, could cure the industry problems created by unfair trade. However, government help notwithstanding, it is incumbent on labor and management to forge a new partnership to serve our mutual interests. In plain words, the company should welcome our members' involvement, give them a piece of the action, utilize their skills and talents. That's been an integral part of Steelworkers' philosophy for years, equally ignored, I must say, for years by employers, until their deteriorating finances required them to do otherwise. Whatever their motives, we seized upon this opportunity and negotiated wherever we could innovative changes in our collective bargaining agreements to involve workers in the full range of decisions that affect their working and personal lives. We first did this with labor management participation teams in our 1980 contract. Some worked better than others, some did not work at all, but they provided the foundation for quantum jumps in this area in our most recent bargaining. During these talks, in the several cases where it was essential, our members accepted wage and or benefit reductions of varying degrees. In return, they received profit sharing and stock ownership plans, productivity bonuses, unprecedented participation in the decision-making process of their companies, and language that puts strict limits on the contracting out of work and provides a substantial measure of employment security. Our agreement with National Steel, for example, guarantees employment security and profit sharing. Minimum profit sharing, even if the company fails to post a profit. Employees who would otherwise be laid off are instead placed in an employment pool without reduction in pay. They are being assigned in one of several manners: to traditional jobs that otherwise would be contracted out, and to temporary vacancies that otherwise would be filled by overtime. To non-traditional jobs, such as work redesign teams, training and retraining, customer service, statistical process quality control, and technical problem-solving groups. Profit sharing and gain sharing bonus plans are permitting national employees to more than recoup sacrifices they accepted in wages and cost of living allowances. We also have a cooperative partnership program in place at National Steel, in which union members have been participating in essentially all strategic decision-making, including capital investment and short and long-range business plans at the corporate level, and scheduling, work assignments, safety questions, overtime, contracting out, and other quality of work life and organizational efficiency issues on the departmental level. We've had a similar program at Wheeling-Pittsburgh Steel Corporation for nearly 2 years. There have been disagreements, which is not surprising, but from all reports the system is working well. It has been endorsed both by our people and the company's people. The mini-boards, as we call these teams at Wheeling-Pitt, have been identifying problems and generating efficient and cost-saving solutions, again including the retrieval of work from outside contractors. Their most recent success was the modernization of a galvanizing line, which has resulted in improved yield, productivity gains, and lower raw material costs. The conceptualization, design, construction, and installation all were done in-house at a savings of 60% on a job that in times past would have gone outside. We also have a steelworker representative on the Wheeling Pit Board of Directors, which makes the circle complete. And let me emphasize, if there is no commitment on the part of management to make these kinds of programs work, then they will not work. We've seen both sides of that coin in successive managements at Wheeling Pit, and we've seen the commitment to make the plan work at National. While the National and Wheeling Pit developments have received the most public notice, they are not isolated occurrences. At one plant, a group of union members and a foreman developed a new processing system that is saving $3 million a year in energy costs at that location alone. A team of pipe fitters at another mill put together a manual for repairing steam leaks that has saved $1 million a year, and in the process returned to our members work that previously had been assigned outside. Steelworkers are meeting with their auto worker counterparts to discuss questions of product quality, shipping deadlines, and other matters that had been handled by sales and customer representatives. This puts whatever problems exist squarely in the hands of the people who know best how to resolve them. Perhaps by demonstrating what competitive is not, we have succeeded with these examples in showing how it can be achieved. These examples do something else. They illustrate graphically that workers are America's most valuable and least utilized asset, that they will go the extra mile when there is a genuine mutuality of trust and concern. Managers who oppose union representation of their employees are wasting valuable resources. They should stop fighting us. Workers are entitled to join unions. We should be putting our energies to much better use, such as repulsing the assault we're facing from foreign competition. Some immediate help can come from trade legislation that gives American industry some breathing room. The longer haul, however, requires several layers of action. It requires managing trade. It's been done now for years in the European Common Market. We too have been involved in managed trade agreements such as the Malta Fiber Agreement, and the American-Canadian Auto Pact. While they're not perfect, they have served a good purpose. We need to refine these kinds of practices, not turn our backs on them. It requires lowering the budget and trade deficits, offering realistic interest rates, and making a commitment to raising capital by increasing production rather than generating capital for its own sake, as occurs in such things as mergers and acquisitions, where workers and their wages are far too often the first victims. One way we can do part of this is by refurbishing the nation's infrastructure, the need for which is universally accepted and which would provide a welcome boost to commerce. This is not just a make-work proposition, as shown by a study conducted at the University of Pittsburgh for our union. This study projects 116,000 man-years of work in the rehabilitation and replacement alone of the bridges of Pennsylvania, with a multiplier effect in related service and supply industries, not to mention the efficiency improvements that a modern bridge system would provide. The jobs that could be created would pay decent wages, enabling workers to be participants in and fuelers of the economy. In other areas, we must push for an opening of foreign markets to American products and reduce the dependency of foreign governments on export-oriented economies, which involve several steps. In Japan and Germany, for example, an increase in consumer spending. In developing nations, an increase in wages and standards of living, and some serious debt relief. In countries such as Korea, the opening up of trade union and human rights. We don't want to beggar our neighbors. We're not opposed to third world development, far from it. But we must deal with it in some more integrated way, not exploit it as a source of cheap and disciplined labor. We need an economy in which the world is advancing, moving forward. If workers are put under the gun in country after country to see which multinational corporation can exploit them the most, that surely creates a kind of world that none of us really wants. Competition doesn't make sense in a global economy if it results in a lowered standard of living, a descent to the lowest common denominator. A debate limited to free trade versus protectionism, given the complexities and opportunities of the global economy, is really a sterile debate. It isn't then, in my view, just a matter of having an industrial economy or a service economy, or of managing trade, or of being competitive. We must have all of them to have a fully rounded society. Nothing magical about our goals. A decent job with a decent wage so workers can provide for themselves and their families and be the kind of consumers of goods and services upon which the nation's prosperity has been built and on which it still depends. A safe workplace so workers can enjoy the fruits of their labor without fear of illness, injury, incapacitation, or worse. A real voice in the decisions that affect them in their jobs. Employment security so that individuals and families and communities may have some rational basis on which to build their lives and their futures. Just and humane treatment for those whose jobs are unavoidably lost, including training and retraining for those who can re-enter the workforce, and income security for those forced into retirement. But this won't happen if American corporations keep seeking out the cheapest labor or pliable governments that will do their bidding, as they have been and are now doing in places like Haiti and Mexico, then pulling up stakes and moving on when they've pumped the well dry. If we don't act, more and more corporations will go offshore, millions more workers will lose their jobs, our manufacturing capabilities will continue to fade, and our status as the world's leading economic power will ebb. American workers are more than willing to become partners in revitalizing our society. They do refuse to be silent victims, to accept on their backs alone the consequences of failed governmental and management policies. They will not accept another air traffic controller's dismemberment. They will not permit unscrupulous managers to capitalize on economic conditions at their expense. They will continue to fight for what is right, not only for themselves, but for their friends, neighbors, and their co-workers. With more than 30 million people living in poverty, chronic unemployment, children facing the prospect of being less well off than their parents, and real income declining, this is the right thing to do ethically, as well as the right thing to do economically. Working together, labor, management, and government can overcome the difficulties we face, and we really see no other choice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williams. The microphone is being set up in the center of the room. I invite you to approach it. We'll also take your written questions. I didn't mean to discourage that completely. If you have a written question, Mark will come around and gather it for me. But our first question is from our board host for the day, Jim Van Dyne.
Mr. Williams, I echo Charlie Hinkle's sentiments that it's a pleasure to have you with us today. During 7 years of Republican administration, and as the global economy has militated against the forces of American trade unionism, some will say that the political clout of the trade union movement in the U.S. has declined perhaps irreparably. What will your union, and in fact the entire labor movement, do next year to improve their fortunes? And specifically, will you endorse any of the existing or announced candidates, or as a champion of labor yet to announce that you feel you could endorse?
Jim, I thought we had a clear understanding at lunch you're going to throw me a soft lob to get this started, and you've not lived up to our agreement. Well, the fortunes of the American labor movement, let me say two things quickly. The fortunes of the American labor movement are not, in my mind, inextricably connected with the results of the next election. There clearly is a connection. Let there be no misunderstanding about that. And we would certainly like to see more progressive leadership in the White House, and we'd like to see a change, obviously, as I think I've indicated in some detail, from many of the policies of the Reagan administration. So we'll be there, and we'll be involved in the election, and our people will be active, and I'm sure we'll be supporting a progressive Democratic candidate when it comes down to the end. We have not endorsed, as we did in 1984, as the labor movement did when we endorsed Walter Mondale. I don't think anyone should interpret that as a lack of interest or any sense in the American labor movement that the endorsement procedure in 1984 was a failure, or that Walter Mondale failed in his quest for the presidency because of that endorsement. Certainly for myself, I don't believe any of those things. I think the Mondale candidacy would have had even more difficulty given the circumstances had it not been for the labor movement's endorsement, but there's little value in discussing the past at this stage. The important consideration is the future. We have not endorsed in this situation because every situation is different, and we're faced here with the circumstance that there are a number of the Democratic candidates who have put themselves forward, almost without exception, who I think would be seen as satisfactory from the point of view of the labor movement. Many of the candidates have very good connections with the labor movement. Senator Simon, for example, is viewed by our members in Illinois as one of us, practically a member, one whose political career and the activities of the labor movement have been connected and have reinforced one and the other throughout his career. Congressman Gephardt is in a similar circumstance with the labor movement in Missouri. Governor Dukakis has certainly established over the years in the administration of the state of Massachusetts a very interesting combination, involvement of labor and management and government. The same kind of thing that I've been talking about today has been in the forefront of developing new mechanisms for the cooperation of these major groups in the state and in our society in terms of trying to deal with and resolve these economic problems. So we have a number of candidates there. Some have dropped by the wayside with whom we've had good connections as well, which is probably unfortunate given the circumstances. I suppose one might say in jest, we'll have to wait and see who's left at the end of the process. But I think maybe we've had enough of all of that. I hope we have. I'm sure the candidates have. I think it's really time to deal with serious policy questions, serious questions about the future of America, and the labor movement will play a role in the debate and play a role in these issues, and we'll end up supporting Jim, a good, fine candidate for the president, and we'll be asking all of you folks to help us elect him and start turning the country around and moving in a better direction.
Mr. Williams, something that you may have a peculiarly interesting perspective on, the recent agreement between the United States and Canada on trade. What effect do you see that having on the labor movement in general, or in particular on the steel industry?
Yeah, I do have a perspective about the trade agreement. Our union's position, both sides of the border, is the same. We're opposed to the free trade agreement on both sides of the border for, in a sense, essentially the same reasons, or for the same fundamental reason. In another sense, I suppose, for variations on those reasons. As I think was clear from what I was saying, the position of our union about these matters is that we need to have trade. We don't imagine for a minute that one can move the economy of America or of Canada or of any country in the world, that we can move the global economy forward without there being trade. The problem is that so long as we try to conduct these trade by these theories, which really have so little application in today's world, why it becomes a beggar thy neighbor kind of proposition, and we seem to be developing trading patterns that promote the interests of one at the expense of the other. That, from our point of view, doesn't seem to be the point. The point should be to have trading arrangements which are mutually supportive of the objectives of workers and economies in both trading partners or in a multitude of trading partners. The problem with the trade pact as we see it is that it invites devastation and difficulty in a number of important industries on both sides of the border. And we think unnecessarily that already Canada and the United States are each other's best trading partners. That trade should grow and will grow over time to the benefit of both countries, but it should be managed in its growth. We should look at how to do it. The Auto Pact, I think, has been an instructive example. It's not perfect. From an American perspective, it needs some revision and updating, but any pact does as we go along. But what the Auto Pact enabled to be done between the two countries was it enabled the tariff barriers to be eliminated in terms of new cars. It enabled the big three auto producers, or the 3.5, counting American Motors throughout most of the pact, to rationalize their production on both sides of the border as if they in truth were dealing with one market. And it guaranteed to the Canadians in this instance, and that's the area which needs to be looked at in terms of guarantees to both countries, it guaranteed employment to Canadians in the industry in proportion to the size of the Canadian market. So it dealt with all the issues. It dealt with having trade. It dealt with efficiency by rationalizing production efficiently. It dealt with getting rid of tariff barriers because it got rid of tariff barriers. And it dealt with the great damage that letting trade flows just flow back and forth as they will, dealt with the great damage that that frequently does to employment patterns in established industries. We think that those trade arrangements could be handled, for example, between Canada and the United States, much more efficiently by dealing with sectors, by looking at sectors like the woods industry, which you're all familiar with here, by looking at the needs of both countries in that regard and arriving at arrangements that permit the advantages of trade without the destruction of basic industries either side of the border. And great concern of America in broad terms, a great concern as we see it from our union on the American side of the border, is the Canadian strength in many resource industries where cheaper energy and in aluminum, for example, and lower wages in steel, not dollar wages, but because of exchange rates in the steel industry, and these sorts of factors in basic industries. Big concern our members have on the Canadian side of the border is in the manufacturing industries. They don't want to have an economy in Canada that's simply a resource-based economy. The term always used in Canada, some of you are probably familiar with it, is they don't want to be just drawers of water and hewers of wood. They want to have a manufacturing element to move into the higher value-added parts of an economic development. And they fear that in a free trade pact, why the great strength of the American market and the American economy and American manufacturing can simply flood them. All of those fears may, to some extent, be unwarranted. Problem is if you just go out there and experiment, you can't tell until the devastation has been done. That's what's happened to the American steel industry. I think there are many people in the country could be persuaded, if we could go back in time, that maybe we should have been much more concerned about steel from Japan and steel from Europe and steel from Brazil and steel from everywhere else if we've been able to see the total extent of the devastation which the havoc it would create. We can see it now, but now to change it and now to move backwards and now to resurrect our industry and to move forward is enormously more difficult than it would have been to deal with the thing rationally in the first place. At least that's our perspective about it, and that's our perspective about Canadian-U.S., the FTA. We say let's have Canadian-U.S. trade, but let's manage that trade in ways that recognize and are sensitive to the enormous complexities of trade today and the damage and devastation that can be created rather than the progress, depending on how it's put together. Let's try to put it together in ways that are win-win and are mutually beneficial to both economies and to the workers and the people in both countries.
What inroads is labor making into the new industries, service industries, high-tech industries? Is that a priority for the labor movement?
Very much so. The priority for the labor movement, I suppose, in terms of the issue which was mentioned a moment ago, too, in terms of the percentage of the workforce that the labor movement represents and what's the future of the American labor movement and all those related questions, the priority is to reach out to the unorganized. I like to say within the family of labor that, if we think about it in business terms, why we have an enormous market. The other side of representing 18 or 19% of the workforce is that you don't represent 80% of it. And so there's a great opportunity out there to represent the other 80%. We think it's appropriate that be done, and we think it's incumbent upon the labor movement to reach out into those new areas, into the service economy. We're obviously going to have a big service economy. Our big worry is not that there's not going to be a service economy. We need a service economy. Our big concern is you won't have one if you destroy the industrial economy, as I was saying. So we need to reach out and organize in these new areas, and we're going to do that. I want to add, I have no doubt at all in my mind that that will be done. The question from a labor movement point of view is whether it will be done by the existing unions, whether they'll find the ability and the heart and the energy to do it, or whether it will be done in some other way. But workers will have unions. Workers will be represented. If you believe in a democratic society, if you believe in the kind of values, and I'm sure we all share, about democracy, about people's rights, about a chance to make a bargain on your own behalf, about a chance to deal with the economic influences and strengths in a society on some kind of equal basis, then employees, for large numbers of employees, for employers, whether those employers are in the private sector, in the public sector, wherever they may be, employees need to have organizations. I think it's very interesting that is to look across the country, and as various states put in place, as Ohio did a few years ago, for example, legislation granting collective bargaining rights to the employees of the state of Ohio, never was a moment's hesitation among those workers by reaching out for collective bargaining rights. There never was a question about whether they're going to be organized or not. The question was simply which union would they be joining and which union would be representing them. I think what applies in that circumstance applies in a very fundamental way across the country, and we will see the organization of workers into unions. The challenge to those of us in the present labor movement is, will they be coming into our unions? As far as the steelworkers are concerned, we believe they will. We're working very hard to bring them in.
Hello, Eloise Carson. Oregon's economy is very dependent on foreign trade, and another city on the East Coast, Baltimore, has the contrast between a large steel plant there, and also they have a major port. Those unions have different views on the trade issue. How do you reconcile those?
No, I don't think the unions have different views on the trade issue, or I'm missing something in the question. We are not, let me underline again, we are not opposed to trade. We're not suggesting that there should not be trade in the world. We are opposed to trade that isn't fair. We are opposed to trade that's based on other countries targeting other countries, subsidizing their produce, being willing to lower their prices, being willing to dump, being willing to do all these kinds of things that have been so much a part of the trading scene, not being willing to open up their own markets in the same way, so much a part of the trading scene. While we, for example, are struggling to have some management of steel imports into America at a level of 20% or thereabouts, 18.5 plus some semi-finished steel. The European Common Market, which talks all the time about fighting against protectionism, limits steel into the European Common Market to about 10% of the market. Now, the Europeans are great traders, and the European Common Market are great traders. But they manage the trade in different parts of their economy. They are not permitting, they're modernizing their steel industry, and they rationalize their steel industry throughout the European Common Market. But they're not permitting the destruction of the steel industry. They're not permitting foreign imports to come in, subsidized to such an extent or whatever, that they destroy the industry. This is the concern. We're very much for trading, and that point of view in our union is the same in Baltimore on the West Coast. We've been distressed for years that steel production in the West Coast has been virtually destroyed in the western United States by imports. There hasn't been a blast furnace operating except for Utah, I guess, west of the Mississippi. Has there, Bob? Just disappeared in the West, and we've been struggling with that all along and have no different view about that than we have in the East.
Mark Hammer, member. My impression is that labor unions got their heyday during the early part of the century, the era of the robber barons and of autocratic management, and that they made their big contribution during a time when they were fighting a more traditional autocratic style of management, and that indeed they have not been very successful in the newer management firms that embrace more participative methods, the IBMs and the Xeroxes and the high-tech firms that have been more white-collar and less prone to labor management organization. In your comments, you indicated that you embrace many of the participative methods, that you're embracing many of those. Doesn't that put you in a kind of a bind of moving a firm toward a company that's not very receptive to organization?
I'm not quite sure. What kind of a bind does that put me in?
If you embrace through your labor organization participative management methods, don't you in effect move the company toward a place where the corporate management does not set the stage for the kind of alienation that results in a fertile environment for labor organization to take place? In other words, work yourself right out of a place in the economic sphere.
No, I don't think so. Obviously, if I thought that was the result, why I wouldn't be. I suppose I wouldn't be advocating what I am. Let me just say two things about that. I've been privileged to be around the labor movement now, as my introducer indicated, for more than 40 years. And I've been hearing throughout all 40 years that, well, unions are a great thing, but they really aren't necessary any longer. And they were necessary in some earlier time, whenever that was. I happen to think that throughout these 40 years, I've been privileged to be involved myself with a host of committed trade unionists in all kinds of industries, doing all kinds of work, who've done magnificent things on behalf of working people, solved all kinds of problems, moved things forward, corrected injustices, made workplaces safer, improved living standards, improved the level of the economy in all their communities, served their fellow man within the plant, outside the plants. Been a marvelous experience. So the labor movement is not finished. In terms of how we deal with the future, yes, I believe very much that workers ought to have the right to be involved in the decisions in the workplace that affect them, because nobody suffers more if a company goes out of business than the workers. The managers usually get golden parachutes, and in any event, they have skills that are very marketable and very mobile. They can take the disastrous skills they've applied as managers in this industry and go over to some other industry and get a job and apply them all over again. And the poor old worker rarely has that opportunity. So I think, I like to say that management is too important to leave to managers. Workers have such an investment in it, they need to be involved in it too. I don't think real participation, real involvement, a real feeling consistent with the democratic values of our society can survive in a workplace without a union. Now I'm saying in a way that the IBMs of this world will one day not work. I don't want to go off on an anti-IBM sort of a kick, because they've done some good things. But I do think that in a very fundamental kind of a way, that if you take these techniques of worker participation and do it in a superficial way, not a real way, so you're trying to make sure the worker feels better and he feels involved and he thinks he has something to say, but in the end he really doesn't. In the heart of it, it's really paternalistic. In the heart, when he says, well, look, if I'm so involved and I'm so interested, and you're so interested in me and I'm so important, why don't I have something to say about how we share this economic pie we're all creating? And at that point, that's a tough question. And if you don't have any way to really participate in not only creating the size of the economic pie, that's the interest we all share, but then in some way dividing that economic pie in a way that's decent and just and recognizes all the needs of people. I don't know any way to do that except through collective bargaining. I don't believe there's any way to do that, consistent, as I say, with our social values, except collective bargaining. And in the end, I think, absent a union, real participation will collapse, because workers, if they're really given a chance and really are invited to be involved, are going to want to share in a meaningful way in the division of the economic pie. And the only way you can do that is to have a union. So I think where managements are honest, and really honest in the total sense, I'm not saying they're all dishonest people or anything, but where they're really honest in the sense that they believe in this commitment to worker involvement, and they believe in going with that commitment where that may take you. I think in the end that takes you to collective bargaining. And so I see it not as an instrument through which our union or the labor movement will make itself less relevant in this society. I see it as an instrument through which we can make ourselves more relevant. And indeed, if America really wants to move forward into that kind of a society, the labor movement has to be an integral part of it. You can't do it on a non-union or an anti-union basis.
Dan Goldie, City Club member. I want to say at the outset that I agree with you about managed trade. But there's a little problem I'd like to have you address. And that is, we witnessed in the post-World War II period a situation where the steel industry, automobile industry, did not put enough investment into modernizing and to improving their efficiency. We saw after the last big tax reduction and increase in cash flows to industry, U.S. Steel went into the oil industry. Used it instead of modernizing steel, they went into oil. My question is, to the extent that you provide protection and the industry has, in effect, some assurance of a bigger share of the market here in the United States, how do we get them to put the investment in to maintain the degree of efficiency and modernization that's necessary to compete in the world? How do you do that?
Well, I think in truth, I don't want to sound like too much the defender of the industry, but I don't suppose there's anything inappropriate in that either. I think we have seen I know we have seen, we've been involved in a very significant turnaround in the American steel industry in terms of investment, modernization, all the rest of it. If you take the measure of continuous casting as kind of the simplest way of measuring that, why we have moved very rapidly into continuous casting, and something like between 60–70% of steel in the United States is now continuously cast. I think that would have happened anyway. I think there's a perception out there that that all happened because of this trade flooding in, which required the American industry to be competitive. I think the truth of the matter is that it happened because of the energy crisis, and I would put the circumstance this way: up until the mid-1970s, even a little bit after the 73 energy crisis, but before 79, all the predictions in the world were that there would be a shortage of steel by the mid-1980s. The world economy was moving forward with dramatic pace. True, we were struggling with inflation and so on, but there was no sense that world growth was coming to an end or coming to a halt, and that had a number of impacts. One impact certainly was that it made everybody in the steel industry in America pretty comfortable. It doesn't really matter what we do. We're going to be able to sell all our steel, so we can keep our plants going, we can work out our old investments, we can move in a nice planned way into the future and into continuous casting. I guess as a footnote, I would say that U.S. Steel was desperately trying to build a new mill in that period at Conneaut, Ohio. And that was one of the first evidences of the inequities around the world. They couldn't begin to get anything like the advantage in terms of borrowing money or government support or anything in our situation that the industry in Europe was getting from their governments at that point, or indeed that the industry in Canada was getting in terms of depreciation rates, which enabled Stelco, Steel Company of Canada, to build a brand new mill on the north side of Lake Erie, right opposite where U.S. Steel wanted to build in the South Shore. So there was some effort at modernization. But the fact that there was going to be a shortage, that also encouraged all these steel mills in the third world, encouraged everybody to go out there, the bankers and everybody, and say, hey, build a steel mill. Going to be room for all your steel in America and Europe and so on. Well, the two energy crises, as you know, turned the world on its head. And suddenly we had this enormous overcapacity in steel. In the free world, I guess we currently still have overcapacity out there in the order of 150 to 200 million tons a year just hanging over the steel market, hanging over the American market, particularly because there's more access even now to the American market than to any other major market in the world. And so I think if you take the international pressures out of it, this situation would have become enormously competitive internally, because no matter what happened externally, there was going to be great competition within America. So I think we would have seen modernization and all these changes regardless. I think it's not really a correct analysis to put all that on the sides of foreign imports. Certainly in the automobile sector, the arrival of new cars, quality cars, had an impact, no question. But again, we're not saying no trade. We're not saying let's not be subjected to any of that. We're saying let's wheel and deal about it. Why let countries take over our markets when we can't have something like equal access into theirs, for example? And I don't say that's the whole answer. I guess if I have a thesis, it is that the answer, there isn't one magic theory out there that does the answer. We need to work in all these areas. But I think in terms of steel, we'd have seen great modernization in any event.
I'm sorry to have to cut this off because I have so many good questions here, and I know there are more in the audience. There are questions on organizing farm workers and on shareholder union participation in corporate ownership. Judge Bork. There's one question, though, of such overriding importance that I do have to ask you, Mr. Williams, very briefly, and that is labor union strikes are of various magnitude, but there's one facing us on which the future of mankind may well hinge. Are the steelworkers supporting the NFL strike?
Yes. I am, we have a committee of strategic, I can't even remember the name of it, but we have a subcommittee in the AFL-CIO of our Evolution of Work Committee whose particular focus is to try to work at developing strategies that everyone in the labor movement can support in terms of critical issues. The committee worked very hard in support of the steelworkers during our lockout with USX, and I am now privileged to be head of the subcommittee that's charged with the responsibility of organizing labor movement support for the NFL football players. And I'm pleased to say that if any of you improperly took a look at your television screens and watched scabs try to play football, you may have seen that we had some considerable impact in a number of cities around the country.
Thank you very much for being with us today.